Time does not always flow as a river. Sometimes it shatters. And within those fractures lie moments no human mind was ever meant to witness. Aris Thorne, alone aboard the Solitude, drifts into the most dangerous contradiction the universe can offer: a scar in time itself. Echoes of the past, visions of the future, and the crushing weight of infinite possibilities, all converging into one impossible moment. Aris will not only fight to survive, he will fight to remember who he truly is. The Solitude drifted from the deep black into a field of shimmering chaos. It was not the star system Aris had plotted, not a predictable series of planets and stellar bodies, but something else entirely, a wound in the universe. Instead, a nebula of fractured light pulsed at the edge of his sensor range, radiating a silent, agonizing scream across all frequencies. The temporal scanners, normally a calm rhythmic pulse that charted the linear progression of time, had gone completely haywire, their readouts a dizzying array of overlapping signatures and impossible paradoxes. The readings fluctuated wildly, jumping from a projected future point to a past event in the same microsecond. He was in a place where time did not flow as a river, but shattered into countless shards, and the effect was mesmerizingly terrifying. The void, once his sanctuary and a predictable, comforting expanse, felt like a living, predatory thing, its light warped into impossible geometries, and its silence humming with an unspoken threat. The shard of the ethereal, embedded in his very being since its last painful embrace, hummed with a low, expectant thrum, a deep vibration in his chest that felt like a promise of understanding and a threat of overwhelming power. He hit the brakes, the Solitude's inertial dampeners groaning and protesting against the invisible currents of temporal flux. Time, he realized, was not uniform here, nor was it predictable. He was experiencing micro-jumps, moments of temporal displacement that made his stomach churn and his mind ache with a piercing, familiar pain. A datapad on his console would flicker from full to empty and back again, its screen momentarily displaying an archaic, defunct operating system. The last sensor reading he took would appear, then a future one from a year ahead, before both dissolved into a cascade of static that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. The Solitude's navigation systems, designed to process space-time as a linear progression and calculate jump points with absolute certainty, were failing completely. The ship's AI, normally a stoic companion with a soothing, monotone voice, spoke in fragmented code, its voice a broken whisper that seemed to echo from multiple points in time. Warning, temporal, instability, escalating. The cold dread that had been a passenger since his encounter with the shard now wrapped around him, a chilling embrace that felt both a physical presence and a premonition of his demise. He was not just observing the anomaly, he was swimming in its malevolent, unseen currents. The first vision was not a flash of light, but a gentle ripple, almost unnoticeable at first. He saw himself, younger, hunched over a hollow table in his university lab, tracing the intricate star charts of the ethereal. His younger self's face was clean, unburdened by the weariness of the long journey, his eyes alight with a hunger for knowledge. The image was as real as the console in front of him, and for a fleeting second he could almost feel the cool glass beneath his hands and the faint scent of ozone from the activated holoscreen. Then the scene shifted, dissolving as a phantom memory. He was in his childhood bedroom, the smell of dust and old books filling his senses, a comforting and heartbreaking aroma. He saw himself, a small boy with an impossible cowlick and skinny knees, staring at a poster of a starship, his eyes wide with a dream that was yet to be tarnished by the realities of space. The visions were not just memories, they were moments perfectly preserved and overlaying his present reality with an unbearable poignancy. A tear welled in his eye, a ghost of a child's hope, a phantom ache for a life of simple dreams he had long since abandoned for the stars. The shard pulsed, a quickening beat against his ribs, as if feeding on the raw emotion of the memory, drawing power from the well of his nostalgia. The visions of the future were not as comforting. They came in flashes, brutal and unyielding, like jagged shards of glass. He saw himself, an old man, gaunt and broken, alone in the cockpit of a derelict ship floating in a desolate, starless void. He saw his hands, wrinkled and shaking, reaching for a console that had long since gone dark, a final, futile gesture. He saw another version of himself, a man with a cold, hard gaze, standing on a dais carved from what looked like a shattered star, addressing a crowd of shadowy figures, his voice devoid of all warmth. This self was a leader, a conqueror, his power a chilling, hollow thing built on an empire of suffering. There was no joy in this future, only a sterile and ruthless efficiency. The visions of a dark future filled him with a creeping terror, a sense of predestination he could not shake, as if his fate had already been written in the stars, and the choices he had made had simply been a way to get there. The shard thrummed now, a deep, resonant hum, as if approving of the darker paths lay before him, a silent architect of his future. He was a canvas on which the shard painted his potential fates, and the brushstrokes were getting darker. The visions began to overlap, a cacophony of selves. The boy with the poster, the young man in the lab, the old man in the derelict ship, the broken man and the cold conqueror, all of them were in the cockpit with him, their faces pressed against the console glass. Their whispers, their thoughts, their fears, and their ambitions became his own, a chorus of voices in his own head. He was 100 different versions of himself at once, each one a different Aris, a different life. He felt the youthful wonder of the boy, the intellectual arrogance of the young scientist, the crushing despair of the derelict captain, and the chilling emptiness of the tyrant. He was no longer a single mind, but a temporal kaleidoscope, a fractured prism of consciousness. The pressure in his skull became a physical ache, a searing pain that threatened to rip his consciousness apart at the seams. He clutched his head, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision blurring. The Solitude's lights flickered in time with his racing pulse, its systems mirroring the chaos within his mind. Then came the others, the phantom echoes of what could have been. The Aris who had never left his home world, a simple farmer with dirt beneath his fingernails, his face creased with a life of hard work and simple joys. The Aris who had died in the accident that had claimed his family. A flash of red light and twisted metal, his final thought a whisper of a forgotten name. The Aris who had embraced a different path, a monk who had dedicated his life to silent contemplation, his eyes filled with a serene, otherworldly peace. These were not memories or futures, but alternate realities, ghost existences that bled into his own, as real and tangible as the chair beneath him. He saw himself with a family he never had, felt the love and the laughter that had never been his. He saw the cold earth that should have been his grave. The sheer volume of these alternate lives, the weight of their joy and their sorrow, threatened to crush his very being beneath an avalanche of what-ifs and might-have-beens. The shard flared with an intense blue-white light, its resonance synchronizing with every version of him that now existed in this temporal soup, as if cataloging them all. The Solitude groaned under the strain, its internal systems struggling to maintain cohesion. The temporal distortion was not just affecting Aris's mind, it was tearing at the very fabric of his ship. The hull plates warped, rippling like a mirage, and the familiar hum of the life support system gave way to a series of groans and metallic pops. Circuits fried with silent pops, and the lights flickered and died, plunging the cockpit into a chilling, crimson glow from the emergency power. The artificial gravity failed, and Aris floated for a moment, disoriented, before it corrected with a jarring thud that sent a shockwave through the deck plates. The ship's structural integrity was at 20%, a digital warning screaming in the corner of his vision. He was trapped in a star system that was actively trying to rip his ship and him to shreds. He was a single, fragile point of order in a universe of escalating chaos, and that order was dissolving. The pain in his head became unbearable, a crescendo of every life he had, could have, or would have lived. The voices of his alternate selves screamed in unison, a chorus of sorrow and rage that threatened to deafen him. He screamed, a raw, primal sound that was lost in the groan of the dying ship. Just as he felt his mind begin to fracture, to surrender to the madness of 1,000 lives, the shard pulsed with a final blinding burst of blue-white light. It felt like a physical blow, a surge of energy that coursed through his body, bypassing his nerves and settling deep into his bones. The visions did not disappear, but were tamed. They were no longer a maelstrom of conflicting realities, but a focused stream, an orderly parade. The shard was not just showing him things, it was channeling them, filtering the chaos into a coherent narrative. The voices in his head, the overlapping lives, all fell into a quiet, orderly line, as if a conductor had just taken to the podium and brought a symphony to heel. The resonance in his chest was now a steady, powerful thrum, a shield against the temporal static. The shard's influence now stabilized his mind, creating a peaceful, almost serene center in the midst of the storm. The chaos outside, the visual noise of the shattered timelines was still there, but Aris saw it with a new clarity that was both terrifying and beautiful. He could see the temporal distortions as they were, a series of intersecting lines of probability, a knot of broken time. He saw the massive gravitational rift at the heart of the system, not as a menacing void, but as a singularity with a vast, invisible temporal wake. The shard was acting as a lens, focusing the shattered light of reality into a coherent picture, a map of the universe that only he could read. He understood with chilling finality that the shard was more than a tool. It was a part of him now, an extension of his will, or perhaps a will of its own that had taken up residence in his consciousness. He saw it, a single, unwavering thread of possibility woven through the maelstrom of shattered realities. It was a path, a narrow corridor of stable time amidst the chaos, a tiny, fragile thread that could lead him to safety. The shard had found it, or perhaps had created it for him, pulling together the disparate timelines into a single cohesive route. He saw himself, a future Aris, standing on a bridge, piloting the Solitude through the eye of the temporal storm. He saw the precise moment he would have to make his move, the exact angle of approach, the exact moment to engage his engines. It was a precise choreographed escape, a ballet of physics and temporal dynamics that he would never have been able to discern on his own. The vision was a blueprint, a precise set of instructions from the future delivered to him in an instant. He had to act. The Solitude was groaning, and its systems were at their breaking point, a cacophony of alarms and warnings blaring in the cockpit. The vision had given him the answers, but he had to choose to follow them, to surrender to the shard's guidance. The shard pulsed with an insistent rhythm, a silent command that bypassed his conscious thought and spoke directly to his will. His own thoughts were a chaotic counterpoint. Was this truly a path to safety, or was he a puppet on a string, being led down a predetermined path he could not see? He felt a new kind of terror, the fear of a loss of control, of surrendering his will to a foreign influence that was now a part of him. But there was no time for hesitation. The hull groaned again, a sound like tearing metal, a sound that told him his time was running out. He gripped the controls, his hands slick with sweat, his eyes fixed on the point the vision had shown him. He engaged the engines, a guttural roar that felt weak against the overwhelming power of the gravitational rift. The ship lunged forward, the temporal static screaming against the hull like a physical wind, a wall of razor-sharp light. The visions flared again, but this time they were a stream of pure data, a constant input of course corrections and velocity changes, a continuous update to his internal map. The shard was guiding him, micro-adjusting his trajectory with a precision that was beyond human capability. He could feel the pressure of the temporal fields, a crushing weight that bent and distorted the very space around the cockpit, making the lights ripple and the air feel thick and viscous. He saw the black hole's event horizon, a perfect, terrifying circle of nothingness. And he knew that if he strayed even a single degree from the path, he would be erased from existence, a mere footnote in the annals of a dead timeline. The visions of his alternate selves returned with a vengeance, their voices screaming in unison as if to warn him. He saw the farmer Aris, his face contorted in fear as his crops withered. The dead Aris, his final thought a whisper of a forgotten name. The tyrant Aris, his expression a mask of cold, calculating fury as his empire crumbled. He felt a moment of pure, blinding terror, but the shard's influence was a steel cage around his mind, and he pushed through it, a phantom, an echo of a ghost that would not be contained. The solitude tore through the final temporal barrier, a ripping sound that vibrated in his very bones, a sound of 100 realities tearing apart. The star-filled void of normal space stretched before him, and the hum of the shard quieted to a low, satisfied purr, like a predator after a successful hunt. He slumped back in his chair, the weight of the moment crashing down on him. The solitude was battered, its external sensors reading 50% damage to the hull, and most systems running on auxiliary power. But it was alive. He was alive. The temporal sensors were once again giving him sane, linear readouts. He had escaped. But he was not unchanged. The visions, the voices of his alternate selves, had not completely disappeared. They were whispers at the edges of his consciousness, phantom feelings and thoughts he now knew were his own, but were not his. He was a library of lives, a vessel for 1,000 different versions of himself, and he knew that he would never be truly alone again. The shard's resonance now felt like a core part of his being, a silent partner, a co-pilot who had taken the controls when he was no longer able. He looked down at his hands, and they did not look quite like his own. They were steady, calm, but they felt a little too heavy, a little too precise. The sensation was profoundly unsettling, a kind of existential phantom limb. He had been so focused on survival, on escaping the temporal rift, that he hadn't considered the cost. The shard had not merely saved him, it had consumed a part of him, replacing his fragile will with its own powerful, unyielding purpose. The vision of the escape, the perfect path through the chaos, had not been a gift, it had been a command, a directive that he had no choice but to follow. He looked out at the star field, a vast, indifferent ocean, and realized with a chill of dawning horror that he was no longer the sole captain of his ship. The shard was choosing his next destination, its hum now a silent, persistent command, and he was simply along for the ride.